All right. So basically, what is API? What is the function of API? API is simply a interface in which a client can have access to information that is stored in the database. So how do there are set of rules, protocols, and tools that allow one application to interact with another without needing to know the intricate details. So they are basically a gateway to your back end data. So the function of an API is if a user wants to retrieve a data, they can't have direct access to your database stored on your server. There need to be a way to checklist and authenticate user requests. So the function of the API is serves as a middleman between your client and the server. That is basically the job of the API, to serve as a middleman between your client and your server. A client make a request to your data to make a request and to receive data from your database. Then your API goes to your server, say, hey, a client needs this information. Do you have it? If the database has it, then it returns the information to the API. The API do the processing and returns it back to the client in the format in which the client wants the data. So one of the analogy I normally make about API, think of an API as a restaurant. You go to a restaurant, right? So when you want food from the restaurant, you don't go straight to the kitchen to get the food. You talk to the waiter. Hey waiter, I need some fried rice. It is the job of the API. The API knows where to go to get your data, your fried rice, and come back to you and give you your request. So a client make a request, and the request can come back to the client in multiple formats. For example, now a client can say, I want my data to be in JSON. I want my data to be in JSON. I want my data to be in XML. I want my data to be in XML. I want my data to be in YAML. It is the job of the API to go to the database, retrieve the information from the database, then format it, present it in format in which the client wants the database. The client wants the data. So there are different kind of APIs. So get my point. The API is just an interface that allows a client to have access to information stored in database. But there are different kind of database out there, a whole lot of database out there. We have what we call the GraphQL APIs, the gRPC APIs, the SOAP APIs, the WebSocket APIs, and the server-sent APIs. And there are a few more beside this. These are all good APIs. They do the required job of retrieving data from the database. But we are not going to learn this. Instead, we're going to learn what we call REST API. What makes REST API stands above these other APIs? I know that most of you might not have even known about these other APIs that I just listed here. Most of what you know is the REST API. What makes the REST API stands above these other APIs? Well, for one thing, the REST API is very simple to implement. It's very simple, very, very simple to implement, and it is very quick to get up an API as soon as possible. But not only that, a REST API allows you to specify your data it allows you to make a request to a REST API allows you to specify the format in which you want your data to be presented back to you. So how do we go about making what you call a REST API? Now, these are the key principles that makes a API a RESTful API, or we call it the constraints that make a API a RESTful API. Now, the first one is that an API must be built within a client-server architecture. What this means is that for it to be called a RESTful API, it must be built for the purpose of receiving requests and returning a response. If it is not built within our contents, it is not considered a RESTful API. And also, an API should be stateless. Just like example, my analogy, the restaurant, the waiter. A waiter is found within a restaurant. If a waiter is not found within a restaurant, it's not called a waiter. So for it to be called a REST API, it must be used within the client-server architecture. Also, it should be stateless. What this means is that the job of an API is to retrieve data based on your request. It does not need to remember your previous request that you made previously during your previous request you made to the server. It is every information that you need from your database must be sent at the moment of the request. There is no memory. An API has no memory. It's just like having a waiter that every time you need a fried rice, you go with all the requirements in which you want for the fried rice to be given to you. There is no way that you come next time to the restaurant and say, hey, waiter, remember what I said the previous day? Then the API will say, oh, yes, I remember what you said to me the previous day. I will go and get it for you. No. For it to be considered a RESTful API, it has no previous memory of the request. That means every fresh request must contain every information that is needed to perform the task of receiving data from the database. Also, a REST API must be cacheable. A REST API must be cacheable. What does it mean for something to be cacheable? It means cacheable means that it has the ability to be stored in a platform or a database or something. It has the ability to be stored on the server side or the client side, so that the database will not to prevent multiple requests to your database server. API must be cacheable. That means key information can be stored, thereby preventing the API from always going back to the database to retrieve information. If you discover that, hey, a user is always coming to request this particular information, why should you always go back to the database to always get fresh data, even when you know that data does not change? It does not change as often as possible. That requires you to go back to the database to request fresh data. So any information that you know has what we call a long change rate. That means it takes a long while before it's changed. You change those data. You store it somewhere else. So when a user make a request, instead of the API going straight to the database, it goes to where it stores the information and retrieve it back for you. And also, an API, for it to be considered a RESTful API, it must be layered. That means that there can be different layers. That, just for example, now there can be different layers before it gets to the actual server. That means if a client makes a request, the different layers can be set in place before the API make a request to your database. And also there must be a uniform interface. That means the way you request information from using a REST API should be uniform throughout. It should be the same. The standard should be the same. So let's go to another important fact about REST API. Most people make a mistake, especially during the implementation. I discovered a lot of naming convention errors. For example, now all APIs must be in lowercase and hyphen to separate to separate multiple words. For example, let me change. For example, let me present something else. Okay. API must be in small letter words.
I've seen some people making API requests with words like this. Let's say a customer database, a customer, and the most likely a customer, then a customer user ID. No, all API endpoints, just as I've written here, this is the wrong way to write API endpoints. All API endpoints must be in small letter words. Small letter words. Customer in small letter words like this. Or if it's a multiple words, you use something called hyphen to separate the multiple words. This is a standard convention when it comes to writing API. And also, you must use clear and concise, meaningful words when you are creating your API. This is a really big deal. Your API must actually mean something. You just don't write random names just to create your API. Your API must actually, the name must actually mean what is actually intended for it to do. If you want to create an API to the customer, you need to give the name. That customer make you know that someone is trying to request information about a customer. So you need to make sure that your API names have meaning and they are concise. They should not be too lengthy. They should not be too lengthy. No, that is wrong. You should be concise and it should actually have meaning. Also, you use forward slashes to indicate hierarchical relationship. You use forward slashes to indicate hierarchical relationship. Let me go back to that place. The Somia. You use forward slashes to indicate hierarchical relationship. So now, customer forward slash ID. Let's just take this as a hypothetical situation. This means that I am retrieving a particular customer from my customer's object. This means that I'm retrieving a particular field. This means this is what you call a hierarchical relationship, or you say customer orders. This means that for a particular customer, I'm trying to retrieve all the orders made by a particular customer. This shows a breakdown of from the top level to the low level of your endpoint. You use this forward slash to show hierarchical relationship between endpoints. And the next naming convention is your endpoint must always use noun to indicate the resources that should be retrieved. You don't use verbs to create your endpoint names. You don't use verbs. You don't use something related to this. You don't say customer get user, get customer ID. No. Your endpoint must be a noun. It is for your HTTP method, status method, that you use verbs. For example, now if you want to retrieve a particular user ID, if you want to retrieve a particular customer ID, you use the customer endpoint and a get method to retrieve a particular customer ID. A particular customer ID. Your get method on this particular endpoint, you don't say get user ID. Or if you want to make a post request to this endpoint, you want to add new customers to this your endpoint, you don't say something like add new user. You don't use this. Your endpoint must be a noun. Then you use what you call your post request on your customer endpoint to add new customers to this your database using this API endpoint. So your HTTP method should be the verb, then your API endpoint should be the noun. Then we go on to the next naming convention, which is you should never use a file name. Let me share the screen. You should never use a file name when you want to retrieve a particular data in a particular format. Remember, I said that the job of the API is to retrieve data in the format in which you want. If you want the data to be sent back to you in the format of JSON, which is the most popular format in REST API, you don't indicate that you want the information to be sent to you using what you call your file extension. You don't do this. Though I know that I didn't see anyone actually do this, but still, to prevent from some of us that are new to this, you don't make a mistake of requesting the format in this format. Like you want a person, a particular customer, and you say .json. No, you don't specify a extension when you want your data to be returned to you in a particular format, or you don't say .yaml. No, you use what you call your query parameters. Use your query parameters to request to determine the format in which your API will be sent to you, using format is equals to JSON or format is equals to XML. Format is equals to XML or any other format in which you want the API to return your data in. And lastly, you should never end your API with a /. So this is a last point on your naming convention. You should never end your API with a /. This is a very common mistake I've seen. Most people normally end their API with a /. They simply end this with customer/ID, then end it with a /. While most back-end development framework will actually complain, they will actually remove this ending slash for you. But it is not a nice convention to end your API endpoint with a /. Instead, you leave it as it is. You leave it as it is. So let's go to the next. Let's go to the next errors I saw during the implementation. What are the best practices when it comes to building API? What are the best practices? The first thing is this. In Python, we normally call it, the first thing is this: keep it simple and very stupid. Your API should do one thing and one thing only. If it's to retrieve a particular customer ID, let it retrieve a particular customer ID. If it's to add data to the database, to your customer database, let it add data to the customer database. If it's to retrieve menu item, let it do that one thing and one thing alone. So it's not in a particular endpoint that you now start doing the processing for many other things. A particular endpoint should not do two things. It should not do two jobs. It should not do three jobs. It should do one job and do it very well. So let's go into implementing this. Okay, the next point is this. You should always provide a filter to filter large results. And you also enable APIs to send response in smaller chunks. Oh Lord, I've seen a lot of people sending massive amounts of information through their API. You should always perform a way of sending information through smaller chunks. You should also create what you call a versioning system. So let's actually go into implementing this with Flask. All this I've said can be implemented in Flask or any other API frameworks. So for this For this project, we are going to use Visual Studio Code and Insomnia to make the request call to our API. Okay. Okay. There is reason why I went through all this first, because it is important that we know. Most people, they just go into programming. Oh, let a project just come up. Let us quickly start writing code. No, you need to settle down and plan your structure. You need to settle down and think, how do we go about implementing this? How do we go? How do you go about implementing our API endpoint? You need to create different structures. When you need to put pen to paper before you actually go into the process of writing the codes. So the first thing first, we are going to use flags. So we're going to create our first file, which is our entry point into our data, into our flags API. So from flags, import flags. App is equals to okay. So I'm trying to create the structure for our flags API. From flags, import flags. So we are going to install the required module for this, which is pip install flags SQL Alchemy. Flag SQL Alchemy. I made a mistake somewhere. Flag SQL Alchemy. Okay, that is it. Okay, it's loading. We're going to build what we call our first route to make sure that it is up and running. Return hello world. Still installing. Set our environmental variables. Flags app is equals to our entry point. Sorry. Hello. Hello. Sorry, my network just went off. All right. So let me continue from where I stopped. So where did I go off? Okay. Okay, my server was up and running. So let me see whether let me okay. Can you guys see my screen now? All right. So my data, let me open my database. Let me open my local host. It's open on our local host. So it is currently up and running. Flask is a very simple framework to implement. So you can get up and running quickly as possible compared to Django. So we know that the job of an API, we are not trying to create what do you call it, a route function that serves a HTML template. So we want our API to have this structure. Let's check out the structure for our API. We want it to have this resource type because the job of an API is to serve resources to our clients. So we want it to have a customer resource, a menu item resource, and an order resource. This customer resource will have the list of all the customers and so on and so forth. So we are going to create a different file for our customers.py. Ideally, I would have created, okay, let me just go on first, customer.api, menu item.py, menu item.py, and order.py. So this will contain all our different routes, all our different endpoints. So for the first one, from Flask, import blueprint, orders blueprint. So you say orders.route. This first endpoint, the job of this endpoint is to retrieve every order that has been made by a customer, every order that has been made by a customer. So say get order. We'll return nothing for now. Let's do for the orders also. From Flask, import blueprints. Yeah, customer. Get customers. Hello, customer. Then we do the last one for the menu item. On Flask, import blueprints. Menu items. Okay. So we'll set up our blueprint. We'll set up our blueprint from menu. No, let me start with customer. From customers, import customer, and so on. From orders, import orders. Then we register these endpoints on our flags. Have the register blueprint and orders. So if we try to access these different endpoints on our server, let's try to access these different endpoints. Oh, I'm getting a customer import error. Entry. Okay, let me restart it. Okay, I'm good to go. Customers. You see, so our endpoint for our customers is working. Others, no, there's something. Okay, it's returning an empty string. Hello, others. Menu items. So let's refresh. Okay, so it's up and running. Now the job of an API is to serve data. We are not going to serve a normal response. We are going to serve data to our front end. So let's just create a simulation of what a data should look like. Let's say, for example, now we have a data is equals to, which is a dictionary, name, John Doe, and the rest, email, John Doe at gmail.com. So we're going to be able to serve this data, import from flags, import JSONify. What this JSONify function does is that it takes your data and serializes it in the format in which it can be served to your clients with the appropriate status code. So instead of serving a pure string, you could just simply say return JSONify so can specify the status code or your response. So if we should run this on our customer endpoint, you'll see that it will return customer. I said I went to. Okay. It's back on. So let's so it is just serve back this endpoint. What is endpoint? A GET request to this particular endpoint means that it should return every data. It should return the list of all the whole customer that is stored on your database, which is just what it is right here. Let me do it in the proper format. So now our customer endpoint is up and running, even though we are working with a fake data. Most often you don't store data on memory in this format. You store data on your database. So we are going to have to first of all implement our database using Flask SQL from Flask SQL, import SQL Alchemy. Okay, to be able to do this, we need to create a new file called our model.py. Now, most often, we should perform what we call separation of concerns. You just don't implement everything on your app.py file. Your app.py file, which is your entry point, should only contain your necessary code. It is important. It should only contain your necessary code. Every other thing should be separated into different files. So in this my models.py, this is where I will implement my different database from flags, initialize the flags, then create class customer DB model from flags. Yeah. So let's see, our customer data is going to have this structure, which is the ID, the name, the email, and the registration date in which the customer joined. So using this structure, we're going to create a database that has this structure. ID is equals to DB column, name, is equals to this, then email is equals to db.column, db.string, then The last one is our registration date. Registration date. Dot column. Now, a value of nullable false means that this particular any attribute that has a value of nullable false means that it is a required field. That means information cannot be stored on this our customer database without this value, without this attribute having its value. So, but for this our registration day, we want to be able to implement a default value. That is, the default value will be the day. The default value will be the day this customer was added to your database. So we're going to import our date time. Then we're going to say default is equals to date time. Date time. Now. So you're going to this immediately this customer model is being stored on our database. It's going to give us the default value of that particular time in which this customer was added to our database, instead of us allowing the clients to add it manually. So the next thing is we're going to create a representation, which is this. Then we'll do the same for our customer. We'll do the same for our order. db.model ID is equals to db column my key true. Order price, then customer ID. We won't do foreign case now. So lastly, we're going to do for our menu items. Menu items. db.model. So what is our structure for our ID? Our menu items, which is our name, price, categories, and what if I do this? Equals to this price, category, and description. Okay, something here. All right, so we have created our database model. This is where the job of our API is to get the information that is being stored on this our model and serve it back to the user that makes the request. So we're going to go on ahead to initialize this our database. We're going to go ahead and initialize this our database. To be able to do that, you need to install Flux migrate. Then here, I'm going to say from Flux migrate import migrate. Delete this. From Flux migrate import migrate. Then also this one here is for our endpoints. Endpoints. database from models import DB. Then we're going to initialize our database using DB. DB dot initialize DB. What this does is that it initializes our database, then we apply our migration on it, so that any changes we make on our database structure can be translated to the physical database. What this migrate function does is that any changes we make to this structure can be translated straight or implemented straight in our physical database. Don't forget to set my secret key. Yeah. So we're going to name this database to, since we are building a restaurant API, restaurant DB. For our database, we're going to use our SQLite. You could change this if you want to use other databases like Postgres, MySQL, and many others. Then app.config. Secret key is equals to config. Okay, so I think we have everything ready. Our models of PY that contain our database implementation, our customer route, our menu endpoints, and our other endpoints. So we're going to initialize our database. Set. I think I've done this before, but let me just do it to be sure. Let me add this to our API. Flags DB init. What this does is it actually initialize our database. You'll see a new file here being created if it's successful. So it is successful. You see a new. This folder will contain our actual database, and this will contain the migration folders for the different changes that is made to our database. Then we'll say flags DB migrate. What this does is that our implementation will actually be translated and used to create our actual database, which is, you see here, our restaurant DB has been successfully created. So next, we're going to upgrade. Flags DB upgrade. So we have our database up and running. Cool. So the next thing is we have our database up and running. Next is to modify our endpoint to be able to store information into that database. So the first thing is we are going to implement. Remember, I said that your API should do one thing and one thing alone. Your API, you're going to create API endpoints using our get method. What this endpoint does is that it retrieves every customers that had been stored into that database. So it's going to do that one thing. We're not going to, in this endpoints, also allow a user to add new customers to our database. It's going to do one thing alone. So we're going to implement retrieving all the users that have been stored to our database, which is to say data is equals to implement from flags import request. This request package allows us access to our request endpoint. So to the data post requests. We're not going to get any information from the database. We are going to retrieve information from the database instead. So we're going to import from models, import customer. Let's work with this. Customer query all. Personify data. Customer.query all. Personify data. Okay. So that is that for our get request. So we'll create another endpoint for the post request. So what this endpoint does is that it saves data, it saves customers to our database through this endpoint. Though they have the same endpoint name, but different functions implement this. Different functions implement this. So you don't do this all on a single endpoint, which is not the right way to do this, to write your API. You don't implement it all on a single endpoint. So this is our post. This endpoint only accepts post request. So we're going to retrieve the information that the user sent through our post request using our request object.json. Request.getJSON. Okay. We're going to import our database from models. So this missing, okay, I request the request object I took off that last time. So this is basically what it does. This particular code, if a user make a request to add new customer to our database, it sends a post request. That post request contain the required information, which is in this format we specify here. This format, in which when we implemented our model, our customer model, is also in this format. So when a user makes a post request, it gets stored, it creates a customer object, which we now add to our database section and save it directly to our database. And we send it over to school. That data has been successfully added. Or if you want, instead of sending back the data again that it added, we just simply send the response and say customer created. As simple as that. So let's go on ahead to test this endpoint. So let's try to make a get request to this endpoint using flags, using Insomnia. Yeah. So this. Set flags up after UI. Python uploads.
Sorry. All right, I think that is it. What is giving this error? Okay. Have the register blueprints. Customer. Okay. But let me check something else. Where is this error coming from? Oh yeah. It's coming from our here. Let me comment this out. To Sorry, having a little bit of issue here. Text requires but 3 were given. Customers attribute. A little bit of patience. Okay. Okay, okay, okay. Just about to. Okay, I forget to enter this method. What's the method? What's the method? Just something that's methods instead. Methods. All right, so that was what I missed. Methods. I didn't add that method. So let's test this out. Let's first of all test this our customer. No. Let's test this our customer endpoint using Insomnia. So let's say on our Insomnia is a tool that is used to test practically. It's used for API development. It's an essential tool for API development, and it is open source and it is free. We also have what we call Postman. So there's no post request on this particular homepage. Okay, so this is our homepage. So let's make a get request to our customer endpoint. No, there's no get request. Okay, yeah, there's a get. I'm having an error with the actual name. Customers just guess. Customers. Where is this error coming from? 404 not found. But when I make it on the actually seeing it here, it's still not seeing it. So my error is method get. Oh yeah. This thing I added. It URL fix. What it does is that it adds a additional localhost. It adds a additional point on it. Oh, that is not what we want. We don't want customer. Instead, we want a single customer. So we're going to remove these guys. I'm going to remove them all. We don't want that additional URL prefix on our endpoint. So we are good to go. So you can see a request to this particular endpoint, which is a GET request, gives us an empty value because there's no information has been stored to our database. Let's look about having a post request on our customer.py. Customers.py, a post request. Let's make a post request. No. And in the body, we're going to give a JSON. And what are the structures that we're going to implement? Our structures are name, email, and registration date. Name, email, and registration date. Name, Samuel, if you email, gmail.com. Registration date. Remember, we don't give the registration date. So we're going to say registration name and what other figure, which is okay, just three. Let's not forget our ID. We should give it a value of 1. Let's just okay. We don't give it a registration date. We create a post request to this server, to this particular endpoint. Okay, property name, double quotes. Oh yeah, I always forget this little stuff. It's supposed to be in double quote instead of single quote. Sorry for taking this long. So this is just basically a simple API implementation in Flask. So I'm going to create another post request. Now, no request, nobody returned for this response. So it has successfully, we have successfully made a post request to this particular endpoint. The first one was to get every information. The next one was to add information to our database. So we're going to make another GET request to that particular endpoint to see if it actually retrieved the information that we just added. Okay, we are doing something wrong. Data dot data dot is equals to okay. Yeah. Yeah, there's the last one. We are not because of time, we're not going to implement the other endpoint. It will take a lot of time to implement the other endpoint. All right, so this is basically a get, a post, and if you want, you could also add for a put, a delete endpoint. You don't get to delete endpoints inside of your get request. You don't get to delete customers from inside of your get request. So this is a post data 200 email URL. Okay, many our ID customer.id. Okay, so let's restart our server. Okay. Let's remake that request. Now, exactly. So you see that the information we stored into our database using our customer endpoints using the method post request. The job of the API is to receive your request. It knows your API should know where to go to receive your information, to get your information that you want. Your API then goes to your database or anywhere else that it needs to get your information, then send it to you back in the format. Remember, I made mention of specifying the format. If I want the requested data to be in a different format, different from JSON, we could just simply modify our API to be in this method. Let's see, where's okay, this is it. Then we add a format is equals to YAML. Then on our front end, we retrieve the format is equals to request dot argument dot get format. Default should be JSON. If a user does not specify the format, the default should always be JSON. Then you can now write the code to change the information that is being sent back to the user to the specified format. So this is basically how API works. API receive, you create your different endpoint. First of all, you create a structure for your endpoints. Then you implement the different HTTP status method for each of those endpoints: the get, the post, the update, the delete. Not one endpoint should implement any two of those stuff. Single endpoint for one job, and you then send back a response in the format that a user specify. Also, I also made mention of filtering, or not sending large amounts of information to through your request, or through not sending large amounts of information back to your client. For example, now if we have thousands of customers, what this endpoint does is that it retrieves all those thousands of customers and send them back to the server, the client that make that request, which is not supposed to be so. You need to implement what you call paginations. What pagination does is that you specify the pages. For example, you say you paginate your request, like page is equals to 1, size, page size is equals to 10. What this does is that it retrieves the first 10 customer in your database. So for this endpoint, I will retrieve the page is equals to request dot act dot get page is equals to default page 1. Then you get the page size is equals request dot args dot get page size. Then default. Okay, let me quickly do this. I'm going to round up here. Default is equals to 10. So for the first page, it's going to retrieve the first, it's going to retrieve 10 and 10 customers from our database. So instead of sending back all the information that all your customer that has been saved in your database, you simply send in the first 10 data, which in Python is simply a matter of, it's just simply a matter of slicing. It will slice the first 10 data and so on. So it returns, instead of sending in thousands, it sends it bit by bit. All right, so that is basically the job of an API. It's used to receive requests and send response from the database back to the client and in the format in which the client wants it to be sent. So thank you for taking your time. I really appreciate this this time is not enough, but thank you very much. Any question, please? Yeah.
No, it's okay. Everything is fine. I was just trying to react, but I'm on my phone, so that's why.